What do you do in that moment when you realize you've been duped, deceived, conned, tricked? Whatever term we want to put on it, that's the dilemma that faces Joshua and the leadership. See, they have been in the process of taking possession of all that God had for them. That God saw this as their inheritance, and He had repeatedly promised He was giving it to them. And the reality is, for Joshua and the Israelites, and you and I, to take possession, to get God's best, all the great things that God has for us, we have to take possession of them by faith. And there will be opposition. Now, for Joshua and the Israelites, that opposition were nations and armies greater and stronger than they were. That the only way they would have the victory, they would actually be able to receive what God had for them, was both by faith, but by the leading and direction of God, and God giving them the victory. As they responded to His direction, then God gave the victory. But over in this little area of Gibeon, the Gibeonites realize what's happening. They understand God has given all of this land to His people. And they realize they've got to do something. So they get pretty clever. In doing so, it makes you wonder if they really understood an aspect of God's character, as we'll see. So what they do is they send a peace delegation, but they also understand that God has promised this land to His people. So what are we going to do? So they have the delegation pull out their oldest clothes, their worn out shoes, old wineskins, moldy bread, old food. And they come to the leaders and say, we have come from a distant land to make peace. See, they realize the only way they're going to get a peace treaty, because they're right in the way, this is something that God has promised His people. They realize they've got to find a way to trick them. Now, there is a little bit of initial skepticism. Joshua says, well, how do we know? And they say, well, when we left, these clothes were new, our shoes were new, the food was fresh, and look at it now, it's practically rotten. And so what happened was Joshua and the leaders do what we all have a tendency to do. I mean, sure, we look at the evidence, but they didn't actually ask God. They didn't seek the Lord, but rather they looked at the evidence and they were convinced by what they saw. And so they made a peace treaty with the Gibeonites, and the Gibeonites leave. But then 3 days later, they realize they've been hoodwinked. That, hang on, you don't come from a distant land, you're literally just right over there. Now the people are upset with the leaders. But Joshua says, we can't attack them. We made a commitment, we made a promise before the Lord, and we have to honor our promise. See, as we'll see, God takes our commitment, our integrity, so seriously. But they do go to the Gibeonites and go, what were you thinking? Now, the reality is, what we were thinking was find a way to get peace or get wiped out. And so Joshua says, we have made a commitment, but you're going to have to serve us. See, the Gibeonites had said, we're completely at your mercy. See, they understood, I think, to a degree, God's character, that God will never change His word. He'll never change His mind. He never goes back on what He says. And He expects His leaders to reflect that same character. So what the Gibeonites do is say, we are at your mercy. They were relying on that character trait. And so Joshua says, well, fine, but you're going to have to serve by doing these, basically manual labor. But the reality is, manual labor or wiped out, easy decision, right? And Joshua and the leaders go back home. Now, not too much later, the 5 kings in the area have heard about the peace treaty, and they recognize the only way we have a chance of defeating Israel is to stand together. We can't have people go off and doing their own thing. So they band together to attack Gibeon, and they've surrounded it to attack it. And Gibeon sends word to Joshua, we are being attacked. Come rescue us. So what do? Again, you've been conned, you've been tricked, deceived, hoodwinked. Is this the out? Is this the opportunity to say, well, hang on, You brought this on yourself. Is this the opportunity to say, sorry, not my problem? But that's not how they respond. Now, interestingly, what got them into this situation was not asking the Lord what to do. When the Gibeonites came, they looked at the evidence and made a decision without asking God. And that got them into the problem. But now they rally the army and their best men to go fight. And they also don't inquire the Lord. But this time they don't need to. Why? Because their commitment meant there was no reason to ask God. They had obligated themselves. See, as the Gibeonites were now basically their servants, they had an obligation to protect them. So now the commitment gets tested. See, until our commitments are tested and proven, they don't mean anything. But we are to reflect the very character of God and being unchanging in our commitment, in our promises, in our word. And so even though they have every logical excuse to say, sorry, we're wiping our hands of you, they go to battle to rescue the Gibeonites. They don't need to ask the Lord because they're following through in their commitment. But as they go, as they've rallied the army, they're on the march. Now God shows up and says to Joshua, don't worry about it. I am going to give you a complete victory in this. See, as they have followed through on their commitment, now God responds by saying, I'm going to give you the victory. So they march all night, they attack. And what we see, and this is found in Joshua's chapter 9 and 10, what we see in a series of battles, they gain victory after victory. And it's obvious God is going before them. God is creating confusion of the enemy, literally sending large hailstones, and at one point stops the sun in the sky for a full day so they can finish the victory. See, the end result was of them responding to the commitment. God gave them not just an amazing victory, a series of victories. That in this one trip, by responding, they literally conquered the entire region and crushed nation after nation after nation because it was God who was faithfully giving them the victory because of their commitment. See, the reality is commitments do get tested. And whether it's because circumstances have changed, things we didn't anticipate, or in this case, we were just flat out duped. And obviously, this is an extreme case. What we see is when we honor our commitment, when we reflect that nature, when we reflect the character of God, then God blesses it and He moves even in situations where, the reality is Joshua and the leaders blew it by not asking the Lord. But they honored their commitment and God honored them for it and blessed them and gave them. In one trip, they conquered the entire region and received this massive blessing. So it challenges you and I. When we find ourselves in a commitment, when it seems like there's a better option, if there would be a way to get out of it, or do we follow through? And I've seen this so often in real life. When we follow through, as the Bible says, swearing to your own hurt, even when it makes no sense, but we're honoring what we said we would do. And watch God bring an amazing blessing.